The clinking of glasses and the soft hum of conversation filled the air, yet a single sentence sliced through the evening like a blade. It was meant to amuse, a careless jest thrown across the table during what was supposed to be a warm, festive dinner, but its sting was unmistakable. The words were directed at me, humiliating, sharp, designed to wound without leaving a mark. In that moment, the laughter around me became background noise. The smiling faces blurred into insignificance. Betrayal settled deep within, but my reaction was a measured pause, a stillness that masked the rising fire beneath. I did not shout. I did not crumble. I simply processed, quietly noting the fracture in trust, allowing the seed of resolve to take root. I folded my shock into calm, adopting a mask of composure that would betray nothing. Every movement, every gesture was deliberate, every glance carefully measured. The family thought they had glimpsed my vulnerability, but I offered them nothing. Inwardly, I cataloged every word, every inflection, committing them to memory as though each were a piece on a chessboard. I would not react hastily. Patience was my ally, observation my weapon. Even as my heart throbbed with indignation, my mind charted the paths available, calculating each possibility while maintaining the illusion of serene compliance. They would never suspect that beneath my calm, a storm was quietly assembling. Amid the laughter and clinking glasses, subtle tensions began to surface. The seemingly joyous evening was a thin veneer, and beneath it, grudges simmered like hidden embers. I noticed the quick, fleeting looks exchanged across the table, the half-smiles that didn't reach certain eyes. The cracks in their facades revealed themselves to me slowly. A hand that lingered too long on a wine glass, a slight hesitation before answering a question, the way some words carried a weight unspoken. It was a delicate dance of deception, and I observed every step, every misstep, cataloging the currents of hidden animosity. The more I watched, the clearer it became that the world I had taken for granted was layered in secrets and manipulations, each offering a glimpse into the true character of those around me. It was the father's presence that cut the deepest. Arrogance dripped from his every word, his smile a mask that barely concealed a calculated cruelty. He wielded emotional manipulation with ease, his opinions framed as absolute truths, his criticisms disguised as guidance. I could see it now. The true threat was not the jest at dinner, not even the subtle familial snubs, but the deliberate way he shaped perceptions, orchestrating guilt and doubt. Every interaction I had with him now carried a weight of scrutiny. I began to understand the scope of his influence, how he had cultivated trust only to betray it, how every gesture and command was a strategic move in a game I had only just realized I was a player in. I began to weave my plans with careful precision. Every thought was a calculation, every memory a tool. I mapped out the course of action, noting the vulnerabilities he had revealed, anticipating his likely reactions. Patience was not weakness, it was preparation. I imagined the steps necessary to turn his arrogance into his undoing, the subtle manipulations that would allow me to maintain control. Each evening became a study of his habits, each conversation a thread to pull in the tapestry of retribution I was crafting. The revenge I conceived was not born of rash anger but of measured calculation, a strategy where every detail mattered, every slip would be recorded, and every outcome anticipated. Small inconsistencies began to surface. Tiny cracks in his carefully constructed facade, a glance too long, a word spoken too hastily, a hesitation that betrayed overconfidence. I observed these moments with patience, knowing that each could be leveraged when the time was right. Secrets he thought buried, assumptions he held unchallenged, all became tools for me to collect. I cataloged them meticulously, connecting dots he believed invisible, turning his own hubris into the foundation of his inevitable downfall. Evidence accumulated silently, like dust settling in the corners of a room, unnoticed until illuminated by the light of revelation. With the evidence gathered, the stage was ready. Every interaction I orchestrated carried a purpose, every word spoken a lure. I allowed him to proceed with his usual confidence, encouraging the very behaviors that would betray him most effectively. The trap was not obvious. It was subtle, a sequence of steps only I could foresee. Each conversation, each casual observation, pulled him closer to a precipice he could not see. my patience had turned into a precise architecture of consequence, a quiet inevitability that left him blind to the danger awaiting him. The first strike came almost imperceptibly, a carefully placed piece of information that began to unravel the illusion he had cultivated. A colleague questioned a statement he had made. A trusted associate noted a discrepancy in his actions. The cracks widened, and he began to sense dimly that the control he assumed he held was slipping. But by then, every move I had anticipated had already been counted, every potential defense considered. The shift was subtle yet decisive, a quiet assertion of dominance that left him floundering, unsure, beginning to recognize the presence of a force he had underestimated. His arrogance, once a shield, now accelerated his undoing. Small missteps snowballed into larger errors, contradictions exposed, secrets surfaced, and alliances wavered. Those who had once deferred to his authority now hesitated, questioning the foundations he had so carefully built. The web of lies he relied upon became entangled in its own threads, the narrative he controlled slipping from his grasp. Each revelation was met with disbelief, each confrontation with confusion, as the reality of his deception became undeniable to all who had been watching, quietly awaiting the culmination. Finally, the moment arrived when all threads converged. The culmination of strategy, patience, and subtle manipulation produced a perfect, unassailable strike. The betrayal, once hidden behind a mask of arrogance, was laid bare before everyone whose opinion mattered. The lies he had crafted with confidence crumbled in public, undeniable and complete. I spoke with a calm authority, presenting truths with precision, leaving no room for argument, no opportunity for deflection. The satisfaction was not in cruelty, but in justice. The orchestration of every detail brought the full weight of consequence to bear upon the man who had underestimated me. As his world collapsed, I remained composed, untouchable in the eye of his unraveling. The consequences he had ignored, the manipulations he had thought invisible, now bore down fully upon him. His arrogance gave way to humiliation, his authority to doubt, his control to chaos. Justice had not required me to stoop. It had required only that I remain patient, observant, and strategic. Every word, every gesture, every calculated move had led to this moment of undeniable truth, and it was complete. In the aftermath, I emerged renewed, the betrayal avenged, and the path forward clear. The lessons learned became my strength, the fire that had ignited in silence now tempered into quiet wisdom. I stepped away from the ruins of his deception, leaving behind the manipulation and arrogance that had once threatened to consume me. The past was settled, the future lay open. I had not only survived, but I had mastered the game, and in that mastery I found peace. The fire of revenge had cooled, replaced by the quiet power of a life reclaimed, leaving a final, unspoken truth. Strength was not in retribution alone, but in rising, unbroken, from the shadows. The laughter at the dinner table carried a hollow ring, masking currents of tension that few would notice, but I felt every subtle shift. Conversations danced around trivialities, yet beneath the polite smiles and clinking glasses, grudges lingered like shadows. Each exchange seemed carefully measured, each comment a calculated probe, testing loyalties and patience. I observed silently, noting the subtle curls of disdain behind a raised eyebrow, the faint hesitation in a voice that sought approval. In the midst of this seemingly ordinary family gathering, I began to see the invisible fractures threading through our relationships, delicate yet undeniable, and the realization settled coldly in my mind. Nothing here was as it seemed. My thoughts drifted to my father, a man whose presence had always commanded attention, whose words could wound as easily as they could charm. The bond we shared was complex, threaded with both admiration and resentment. I had learned early to navigate the balance between respect and defiance, honoring his authority while guarding the spaces where his influence could not reach. His reputation for cunning had always been evident, but now, beneath the surface, I sensed a deliberate, calculated cruelty. Every smile he offered was measured, every question laden with expectation. I had known him for years, yet this night, for reasons I could not yet fully articulate, his intentions seemed sharper, more dangerous. And then there were my siblings, whose loyalties were as opaque as the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. Their quiet glances and subtle nods suggested alliances I could not fully decipher. Were they complicit in favoritism, or merely pawns in the intricate game my father had perfected? I noted the way they deferred, the faint satisfaction that lingered behind fleeting expressions, and the unease settled deeper. Trust became a careful calculation. Each interaction weighted, each smile scrutinized. I realized that to navigate this household, I would need to understand not just my father, but every player moving unseen in his orbit. Memories surfaced unbidden. Fragments of moments when my achievements had been overlooked, my voice dismissed, my efforts diminished. Small humiliations, seemingly inconsequential at the time, now formed a trail of invisible wounds that had etched themselves into my consciousness. I catalogued each slight with quiet precision, recalling the sting of recognition denied and the satisfaction of others elevated above my merit. The pattern was unmistakable, subtle, persistent, and deeply rooted in control. It became clear that my current awareness was not sudden, but the culmination of a lifetime spent navigating calculated disregard. Observing my father now, his overconfidence and subtle manipulations became alarmingly evident. Each comment, each gesture, carried the weight of intention. He believed his control absolute, his authority unquestioned, yet the patterns of cruelty he had honed over decades now lay exposed to my careful scrutiny. I watched without reaction, each revelation strengthening a silent resolve. His manipulations were deliberate, predictable even, and in understanding them, I began to see the architecture of power that would allow me to dismantle it when the moment was right. Though the sting of recognition pricked sharply, I concealed it beneath a calm exterior. I spoke carefully, smiled where necessary, and nodded at points of discussion, all while my mind recorded every nuance. Emotional restraint became my tool, patience my shield. I refused to allow anger to betray me, refusing the temporary satisfaction of confrontation in favor of the enduring power of preparation. Every detail was noted, every vulnerability assessed, every possible outcome imagined. My hurt was private, a silent engine driving my strategic thinking toward its inevitable culmination. As I observed, the seeds of strategy took root. I noted the arrogance that had always defined my father's interactions, the blind spots created by his self-assuredness. Each slip, each casual dismissal, became a potential lever for the future. I began to plot, mentally testing scenarios, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited. The path forward was not yet actionable, but in its conception I found clarity. The potential for justice became a blueprint, and my mind, once reactive, now moved with the precision of a seasoned tactician. I understood the importance of timing, the power of patience, and the necessity of a flawless execution. Family, friends, and extended relatives, unintentionally, provided insight and leverage. Their comments, their judgments, their assumptions, all became threads I could weave into the larger pattern of strategy. Every interaction, every observation, became a piece of the social chessboard upon which the outcome would be determined. The broader context revealed not just my father's weaknesses, but the opportunities for influence and advantage that I could exploit without exposing my own intentions. The world around him, oblivious to his vulnerability, became the arena for the quiet construction of his eventual undoing. In the quiet moments that followed, I made a singular decision. I would act, but only with precision, only when every piece was in place and the timing impeccable. The patience I had cultivated would become my advantage. The anticipation of his downfall, my silent companion. Every plan, every consideration led to this point of readiness. I resolved that justice would not be rushed, that it would arrive with certainty, and that my own integrity would remain intact, unsullied by the bitterness of hasty retaliation. This was not impulsive revenge. It was strategic inevitability, and finally, the spark ignited. His hubris, the very arrogance that had once inflicted humiliation, became the catalyst for my resolve. I recalled every slight, every manipulation, every instance where he had assumed my weakness. In that clarity, I felt a quiet triumph. He had humiliated me, believing I was powerless. He could not have been more wrong. My resolve crystallized into unwavering purpose, a silent promise that the consequences of his actions would unfold precisely, deliberately, and without mercy. The stage was set, the plan complete, and my resolve absolute, signaling the beginning of a reckoning long in the making. I began by watching. Nothing dramatic announced itself. No single headline moment appeared to justify the cold ledger I started to keep. Instead, patterns revealed themselves in small, steady ways. Late-night calls that always ended when I entered a room. Payments that shifted with no explanation. Compliments directed where they would sting most. I wrote each detail down, not with fury, but with the discipline of someone building a case. Dates, phrases, the exact tilt of his smile, everything mattered. Where others saw family noise, I saw consistency. Where others accepted excuses, I saw repeats. Over time, the list filled, not as proof of one wrong, but as a map of repeated choices that had cost me more than they had ever cost him. Old connections that had once felt worn and distant found new purpose under my care. A colleague who owed me a kindness from years ago, an aunt who never understood his charm, a former partner who had quietly suffered similar slights. Little bridges I had once barely crossed became routes for influence. I reached out with gentle reminders and careful truth-telling, offering listening ears and mutual interest rather than pleading. People returned, not because I begged, but because the conversation I opened was honest and useful. Slowly, a quiet network formed, made of those he had overlooked and those I had never abandoned. Their presence broadened the angle from which I could act. They provided context I could not manufacture, and their memories filled gaps my notes could not. Memories came like flashes, sharp and precise, each one landing with the weight of evidence. At graduation, his applause had been reserved for another. At a baptism, a toast had praised someone else's sacrifice, while my contribution was a passing remark. He had joked privately under the guise of humor, and everyone laughed. I tasted those moments again now, not with bitterness, but with clarity, cataloging how each slight had nudged me toward a smaller space over the years. Those old wounds were not raw so much as instructive. They taught me where he thought he could press and where I would resist. They gave me the emotional clarity I needed to remove feeling from calculation. I studied him the way others study weather patterns, predictable, cyclical, and often harmless until ignored for too long. His routine was a series of small rituals, a confident remark after a meal, a particular flourish when speaking of legacy, a fondness for public praise. Each arrogance-fueled habit became an angle I could use. He liked applause. He craved being the center. He surrounded himself with people who reflected his image back at him. He was careless in private with those he thought beneath notice. I wrote this down too, not as a grudge but as instruction. Knowing how he thought meant I could think one move ahead. From that knowledge, a plan took shape that felt inevitable because it was simple and exact. There would be no shouting matches, no axe meant only to wound. My strategy relied on timing, exposure, and the precision of truth laid bare. I would reveal the consequences of his choices in the very arena he used to amplify himself. The family, the social circle, the networks that fed his vanity. Each step was scheduled, each disclosure placed so it could not be deflected. I would not seek vengeance for spectacle. I would dismantle the structure that allowed him to preen. The blueprint held contingencies and graceful exits. It assumed errors and corrected for them. The end goal was not humiliation for its own sake, but restoration, to myself and to those who had been misdirected by his performance. He carried on as always, oblivious to the slow choreography around him. His overconfidence read like a public proclamation. Everything he said sounded true because he said it so well. No one seemed to notice the small inconsistencies I had tracked. Even those who might have suspected accepted his explanations because they wanted things to be smooth. That blindness was my ally. While he basked, I continued to collect confirmations, letters, receipts, offhand remarks recorded by others who trusted me with memory. He remained the same man he'd always been, charming to most, dismissive to some, convinced of his own righteousness. This constancy made him predictable and exposed a flaw I could exploit without risk. I tested the edges of his armor with tiny moves that demanded little yet revealed a lot. A casual question in front of the wrong person, a misplaced document left where it could be seen, a misattributed compliment allowed to stand. These were probes, not attacks. Each response was a lesson. When he scolded a confidant in private, the confidant later confirmed the pattern. When he altered a ledger, an old friend noticed a discrepancy. None of these actions reflected the full plan, and because they felt isolated, they never triggered immediate suspicion. They confirmed the vulnerabilities I had cataloged and taught me which allies would stand firm when the moment of exposure came. Suspense thickened as the net tightened. Every movement felt heavier for both of us. I measured the distance between his confidence and the evidence I held, watching for the day the two would collide. My notes multiplied and my contacts deepened their understanding of what I would do. The quiet work, calls made, documents verified, allies prepared, made the inevitable confrontation surgical rather than chaotic. Outside observers continued to laugh and clink glasses, unaware that I had arranged the very facts that would one day make those laughs sound hollow. The tension was not theatrical. It was a pressure that built with patient inevitability. When I stood poised to strike, my calm was the product of preparation rather than lack of feeling. I had rehearsed the reveal until it could not be misread. I had lined up witnesses who would speak to truth rather than resentment. I had ensured that every claim I would make could be corroborated, that every accusation would fold into the larger narrative in a way that left no room for obfuscation. Confidence in that moment felt like a quiet armor. It kept me from reaching for grand gestures and held me to the plan I had designed. The moment approached not with fanfare, but with the steady ticking of something long planned. I thought of the years I had spent waiting for clarity, of the tiny humiliations that had sharpened my resolve, and of the deliberate architecture I had built to correct the record. The timing was not about revenge for its own sake, but about righting the balance he had so carefully tipped. I had waited for years for the right moment, and now the moment nearly stood before me, poised, precise, and irrevocable. His arrogance was the first crack in the foundation, subtle, yet telling. Words spoken too loudly, boasts delivered to the wrong audience, and gestures meant to impress betrayed a lack of caution. He moved with the confidence of someone untouchable, unaware that each proud step carried him closer to exposure. I recorded each infraction silently, my mind noting the overconfidence that would become his undoing. He believed in the infallibility of his position, blind to the way his missteps painted a roadmap for those paying attention. In his complacency, he had unknowingly handed me the leverage I had long awaited. Then came the slip, a small misjudgment that others might have dismissed as inconsequential. A letter misfiled, a comment overheard, an agreement casually referenced in the wrong company. All details I had been quietly cataloging for months now aligned into a visible weakness. It was the kind of error that spoke volumes to those who knew where to look. My pulse did not quicken. The moment was simply recorded, assessed, and integrated into the plan that had been forming for years. The catalyst had emerged, and with it, a path that demanded precise action. I moved next with deliberate care, calculating every step before it touched the surface of reality. Each maneuver was measured, each interaction choreographed to exploit the vulnerability revealed by his slip. I allowed him to act as he always did, confident and unobservant, while I positioned elements of the plan so that his own choices would set the stage for exposure. There was no haste, only the methodical execution of preparation accumulated over countless months, every angle considered, every possible outcome anticipated. The allies I had quietly cultivated began their roles, unseen yet crucial. They offered support that appeared casual or coincidental, a confirming observation, a withheld reassurance, a timely piece of information. No one suspected that these small actions were coordinated, synchronized to nudge events in a direction the father could not foresee. My network operated invisibly, moving within his orbit while he remained convinced of his absolute control. Their subtle influence amplified the leverage I already held, ensuring that his downfall would be inescapable and complete. He sensed a shift, the faintest prick of intuition that something was wrong. Yet his arrogance acted as a shield, blinding him to the magnitude of the threat. He questioned his assumptions briefly, but dismissed his unease, returning to his habitual overconfidence. Every word I uttered, every smile I offered, was a part of the larger design, and he remained none the wiser. Suspicion flickered, but it lacked the force to challenge the pattern I had established, leaving him vulnerable to the consequences he could not yet comprehend. Each move he made brought him deeper into the labyrinth I had prepared. The missteps I had anticipated, the arrogance-fueled decisions he assumed were clever, all guided him closer to the trap's center. Layers of strategy intertwined with one another, creating a complex lattice through which he unwittingly traveled. He thought he was manipulating events to his favor, but in reality, each act tightened the net I had been constructing with patience and precision. Every pathway led to the same inescapable conclusion. Through it all, I remained calm, detached, almost serene. His panic, subtle though it became, and his persistent overconfidence provided all the momentum I required. I let him move with freedom, allowing the weight of his own folly to generate the chaos necessary for my plan to work. My composure was the unseen hand that guided the outcome, the quiet center amid the storm he created for himself. He struggled against nothing, not realizing that his greatest enemy was his own unchecked certainty. The net drew ever tighter around him, its threads invisible but unyielding. Each action he took seemed autonomous, yet it only served to bind him further, closing in on the consequences he had ignored for so long. He remained unaware, believing he had mastered the circumstances, while I watched with anticipation, knowing the moment of irreversible collapse was nearly upon us. The tension built without spectacle, a quiet certainty that the culmination of years of preparation was within reach. And then he realized, too late, that the web had been there all along. Every boast, every misstep, every manipulation he had relied upon now ensnared him. His eyes widened as the pattern became visible, but the revelation came only after the trap had closed. There was no escape, no last-minute correction, only the stark understanding that the power he had wielded so carelessly was finally turned against him. In that instant, the patient, deliberate work of years bore fruit, and the story of his downfall, crafted with precision and restraint, reached its inevitable and satisfying turning point. Every piece was aligned, every detail meticulously considered, and the moment had arrived. Months of observation, silent calculations, and careful orchestration had led to this point. I moved with deliberate calm, knowing that every variable was accounted for, every ally in position, and every misstep the father might make already anticipated. There was no hesitation, only the quiet assurance that what I had built was flawless. The final setup was complete, and the stage was ready for the inevitable reckoning. I stepped into the public sphere with the confidence of someone invisible yet omnipresent. Every eye was unknowingly drawn into the unfolding plan, each observer a silent witness to the carefully constructed drama. The father, in his habitual arrogance, remained unaware that every boast and miscalculation was now a performance for an audience he could not see. My movements were subtle, measured, and calculated, ensuring the execution would appear natural while the consequences unfolded with precision. In plain sight, I turned his confidence into a spectacle, letting the world watch the unraveling of a carefully maintained facade. The first domino fell with quiet inevitability. Secrets I had painstakingly documented surfaced one by one. Hidden transactions, casual manipulations, and overlooked betrayals that painted a portrait of deceit. Each revelation landed with a weight the father could not deflect. He shifted uncomfortably, attempting to regain composure, but the evidence was indisputable. Those around him gasped, murmured, and exchanged glances, while I observed the chaos with serene clarity. The culmination of my preparation had transformed whispers of truth into undeniable proof, and the world could no longer ignore what had been hidden in plain sight for years. Shock washed over him as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. Every carefully guarded secret, every instance of arrogance now laid bare, left him grasping at control that no longer existed. His eyes darted, searching for a lifeline, a way to reverse the tide, but it was far too late. The web I had woven with patience and foresight had closed completely, and the father understood with rising dread that his fate was no longer in his own hands. The full consequences of his actions pressed down with a weight that stunned him into silence. Amid the unfolding chaos, I remained composed. I did not need to raise my voice or confront him with overt triumph. The spectacle itself was enough. Disbelief, shock, and murmured speculation swept through the room, leaving him exposed while I retained the quiet mastery that had guided every step of the plan. My presence was calm, deliberate, and untouchable, a stark contrast to the disorder around him. The impact of the revelation spoke for itself, and I allowed it to resonate fully, knowing that my restraint amplified its potency. Triumph settled over me not as fury, but as measured satisfaction. Every move had been executed with intelligence and precision, each consequence unfolding exactly as intended. There was no need for vindictive display. Control had always been the greatest weapon, and now it shone in its quiet supremacy. The father's panic and loss of composure were sufficient, a testament to the power of patience, foresight, and strategic mastery over raw emotion. In this, the revenge was complete without a hint of unnecessary rage. One by one, his authority and influence slipped away. Carefully cultivated power and long-held secrets unraveled under the weight of exposure, leaving him stripped of the control he had taken for granted. Colleagues, family, and acquaintances now saw him as he truly was, flawed, fallible, and outmaneuvered. Every carefully guarded advantage dissolved, leaving him vulnerable and powerless, a stark illustration of how arrogance unchecked could collapse under the weight of calculated observation. A quiet, chilling understanding passed through him as he fully grasped the depth of his defeat. Recognition replaced denial, and for a fleeting moment, the magnitude of his miscalculations and the precision of my strategy became undeniable. He had been outsmarted in every sense, and there was no recovery from the intricate web that had entrapped him. The realization was absolute, and I allowed that awareness to settle, a silent acknowledgement of the power that patience and intellect wield over impulsive pride. The aftermath began with a subdued finality. All his power, influence, and illusions of control had been dismantled, not through anger, but through methodical design. I had orchestrated every step, leveraged every weakness, and let the natural course of exposure deliver justice. In the quiet that followed, the clarity of victory was undeniable. All his dominance and carefully nurtured image were gone, replaced by the undeniable truth of his downfall. The lesson had been delivered, and the story concluded with the quiet, enduring power of precision over pride. All his power, all his control, gone by my design, not my anger. The consequences began to unfold with an almost cruel inevitability. The father, once the unchallenged center of respect and authority, found himself stripped of both, each misstep magnified in the eyes of those who had once deferred to him. Every whispered doubt, every raised eyebrow, and every quiet accusation he had ignored for years now gathered weight, forming a tide of public humiliation he could no longer control. The carefully guarded edifice of his influence crumbled around him, leaving a man who had ruled with arrogance exposed in the harsh light of his own undoing. His reputation fractured under scrutiny. Friends who had admired or feared him recoiled, colleagues whispered behind closed doors, and even family members who once seemed loyal now regarded him with a mix of pity and disbelief. Each revelation, each carefully documented proof of his misdeeds, spread through the circles he had dominated, eroding his image piece by piece. The power he had wielded so confidently now slipped through his fingers, and he could feel the sharp sting of isolation as the walls of authority he had built disintegrated before him. Amid the chaos, I remained composed, the calm eye in a storm of exposure. Every detail of the downfall I had anticipated, every reaction unfolded exactly as I had predicted. I thrived quietly in the knowledge that patience and strategy had outmatched pride and impulsiveness. There was no need for overt triumph, no requirement to gloat or assert dominance. The orchestration of events spoke for itself. In every hesitant glance, in every faltering word from the father, my quiet victory was already visible. The collapse of his facade was a mirror reflecting his own arrogance. Every boast, every manipulation, every dismissive word he had spoken became the seed of his downfall. In exposing his overconfidence and misdeeds, the truth revealed itself not as a punishment I imposed, but as the natural consequence of his choices. It was clear now that the enemy had always been within him. The very pride that once elevated him had become the instrument of his ruin. Triumph settled over me in measured waves. I felt no rage, no need for revenge beyond the perfect execution of strategy. Satisfaction came not from shouting or confrontation, but from the deliberate mastery of circumstances, the patient alignment of timing, and the intelligence applied to every move. The father's collapse had been complete, yet I remained untouchable. a quiet force whose power had always been rooted in intellect rather than impulse. Acknowledging the closure of this chapter, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The conflict that had shaped years of observation, patience, and calculation had reached its conclusion. The path forward was clear, and the lesson endured. Precision, forethought, and control always prevail over arrogance and impulsivity. I turned the page with confidence, my resolve strengthened by the knowledge that justice had been served without compromise. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't strike back. I let his own hands write the story of his disgrace. In that silence, in that deliberate restraint, the true power of strategy was revealed, and the victory was complete.